Welcome to Reimagining Anti-Violence Work, a small space where we're going to unpack the big issues currently impacting the anti-violence field and collectively dream up a new future. Hello, anti-violence workers, leaders, and anyone else that's made their way here. I'm your host, Steph Klotz, a former anti-violence worker and a member of the We Deserve Better project. Today, I'm joined by Hoiyan, a former anti-violence advocate and current grad school student studying for a master's in social work. And since we all know education isn't cheap, Hoiyan also works at a comic book store to support herself throughout her studies. We'll be chatting about her experiences in anti-violence work, why she left the field, and her visions for a brighter future. Welcome, Hoiyan.
Thank you so much for having me, Steph. It's an honor.
Thank you so much for being our first official guest and survivor to share their experiences. So I know it's when we're talking about a movement, that first to go is often a big role. So I really appreciate you joining us. So to get started with our questions, I wanted to first know what inspired you to seek employment in the anti-violence field.
So, I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse as well as intimate partner violence. And when I look back at how I grew up, and I try to pinpoint what kind of supports I received or what I had around me at the time, especially when I was going through abuse, and realizing now, like nobody around me talked about it, nobody told me that I could get help, and nobody prepared me for how to handle these things. I didn't find out about victim advocacy centers until I was in college. And
Wow.
when I started uh, interning and volunteering at a local rape crisis center, and I didn't even know that there was this whole field of anti-violence work in this country. And working in that field was very healing for myself as a survivor and for a lot of people that I've met in that line of work as well. It draws people to that line of work because, when you've gone through something, you want to help others. I firmly believe in this innate human nature that we want to support other people. So it was very fulfilling to be able to support others in the way that I wish that I'd been supported. Now, as for why I left, that's a long story, which I'm sure we're going to get to in this
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, like many folks that work in this field, it comes from a place of some type of survivorship. Not everybody, right? We never want to say everybody, and that wouldn't be true, but for many folks. And you're right, it does provide healing in a certain way, and it also makes you a little bit vulnerable to being impacted by what you're doing in a certain way, a need to be protected by your agency in that work. And we certainly are going to get to kind of what motivated you to leave. That is my next
Yeah.
question. So, can you share a little bit about your experiences and what motivated you to leave? So we know there's this positive, fulfilling experience. What's kind of the other side of that coin?
I will try and summarize over 10 plus years of my experience in the anti-violence work as much as I can. I have stories upon stories, which, if you've been a social worker in like just anti-violence work for a year, you already have so much lore to share. But I've been involved in anti-violence from many, many different perspectives because I started out in direct victim service. I was on the suicide hotline, which was a crazy first job to have, freshly graduated from college. Still remains to this day the toughest job I've ever had. I was victim advocate, and then I moved into more administrative support positions at like a local center. I became a worker at a state coalition for anti-violence, and then I was in a national prevention program. So many different tiers and levels. And on every single tier and level, I report different kinds of burnout, vicarious trauma, and also this is the big one for me was what ended up pushing me out was the toxicity in those work environments. And there's just something about this work that I'm not sure how to explain, kind of recreates the conditions of like abuse that survivors come to these types of places for support for those workers, if that makes sense. Just lots of things that pushed me out. Um, but in also, besides the fact that in my experience, the closer you are to direct service, the more susceptible you're going to be to vicarious trauma because you are in the trenches working with clients directly, getting those stories, being exposed to all kinds of things, and the less you're compensated for it on that level. So
Yeah.
lots of things.
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, your experience really speaks to what a lot of workers navigate that. And I think what adds, I think, power and resonance for me, and I would imagine for our listeners, is that you had positions all throughout different levels and spaces and really saw these dynamics perpetuated in different agencies, right? My experience is within one agency, right? Maybe different in different ways in which those dynamics are showing up, but to see it in so many different ways, right? To see that toxicity and that abuse of staff happening is gaslighting in a way, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at, right? This idea that we're in this mission to end abuse, but that's happening within the walls, that's happening within this agency that's supposed to be ending it.
Yeah, 100%. I can't name the amount of times that I've heard, it's for the mission. We're squeezing water out of a rock every single time and being told that, you know, our burnout is not an excuse and there are people who need us and you're superheroes. We support you. We love you so much for what you're doing, but also we're not going to compensate you. We're not going to listen to the very real concerns that you have in doing this work, even like legitimate safety concerns, because at the end of the day, it's about the mission.
Yeah, that exploitation of the heart and soul that drives many advocates, because clearly that's not the money that
No.
folks go into this line of work for. So we're already kind of taking a hit there. And then exploiting the it's for the mission, exploiting your desire to help to kind of justify the ends. That's a really powerful thing to think about. So we heard in your intro that you are currently employed at a comic book store. What is it like working in the retail setting? How is that different from anti-violence work, or is it, since, we know it's about the people?
So the only difference is I realized when I was working in, especially at nonprofit environments and anti-violence work, there is a type of bubble that we do get into, where it's like, oh, we get used to all these acronyms like Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, all these stuff. And then sometimes I do feel a little crazy working in retail of like, I'm someone is having like a 30-minute conversation with me about like Superman evil, Superman good. And I'm like, there are things happening outside of this building that are very concerning and real. And I like it's the real world exists out there. But at the same time, people are, when people are like, oh, don't put politics into anything, politics is everywhere, social work is everywhere. I actually, one of the selling points that I gave when I applied for the job was like, I've been in social work, I can talk to anybody. And truly, yeah, but at the same time, I think it's very important. I love what I do at a comic store. I'm happy that I actually get to do something that I can nerd about over and be involved in. I am working on my master's though, because I do want to become a clinician. I do want to get back into the fray. But it's still applicable. There are stories. I want to curate a whole list of comic books and graphic novels for people in the anti-violence field that are so relevant because there are stories that are very pertinent to what we do.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you mentioned that because I was never a comic book person growing up. My oldest brother was the comic book person in our family. And when I started teaching about resilience for a protective factors training, and I really started thinking about that, I was like, number one, love resilience. It's my favorite. And it started making me think about every like superhero's origin story, right? It's like navigating these like tumultuous times, this horrible thing, and turning that pain into power, and then using that to help others, right? Help prevent that pain. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I need to really reconsider how I feel about superheroes. And so I need to know, and I bet some of our listeners need to know, what's
Yeah.
your favorite? Whether favorite comic and favorite superhero, maybe it's the same. I know there's a difference, so I want to be respectful of that also.
Yeah. There are so many stories in the comic book world that talk about resilience, to your point. There, and most importantly, kindness as well.
Mm.
I think my favorite comics right now, there's one called The Ghost Keeper by Johanna Taylor. It follows a therapist for ghosts who is trying to help the dead like move on and find their peace. And I think it's such
Oh,
a great story about like boundaries and burnout and the importance of community when talking about these ghosts who are like everybody who's alive, is trying to like either get rid of me or can't let go of me. And so
mm.
that's one, but my favorite superhero of all time is Barbara Gordon, Batgirl, who became Oracle, because she's like the dispatcher for the Justice League. And I
Oh, very
felt that way
cool.
when I was working on the suicide hotline. I was like, I feel like Oracle. I feel like I'm connecting the dots for people. So thank you for giving me this chance to nerd out a little bit, but I love doing this.
Yeah, no, like you said, I really do see a lot of the parallels in those storylines. And I think I also love that while you're in grad school, while you're taking this beat to have a separation from that toxicity, are working in a place where you're able to find some joy. And we know there's no such thing as a bubble from the real world. That doesn't exist. But to be able to, earn some income while doing something that gives you that joy, uh, for someone
Yeah.
that's a social worker, if you're not in the mission, sounds like kind of the perfect place to be. So I love that.
Yeah. It 100% lets me, I can turn my brain off a little bit because when I used to work in the anti-violence field is like you can never, you
No.
can't escape. You cannot have that separation. So with this, I'm able to like, I go to my job and then I go to school. It's really nice.
Yeah. So I know when we met, you mentioned that you were an advocate in Florida. And so one of the things that I've been wondering is what it was like working in the anti-violence field in a state where the political climate doesn't really align with the values of that mission.
So I've been in Florida for over 15 years at this point in my life. And things just keep getting progressively worse, of course. And this is the thing that I noticed, especially the further up I went, the closer I got towards the federal funding or the state funding. It was very frustrating because there's obviously the intentions of funders are not aligned with the intentions that we have in this work. And especially when we have a governor or state that is actively hostile against everything that we stand for and siding with oppression. Right now, the biggest thing in Florida, of course, is, with immigration and the ramping up against undocumented migrants, just against anybody who's brown. And I am a queer Asian American as well. I have many marginalized identities, and there's a very, very hostile feeling that you get when you're in the field coming from the funding side, which holds the purse strings over your head like a sword, and being told you can't put anything in your documentation that evokes, I guess, what they would call critical race theory or things like
Hmm.
that. Or you know, the governor actually says we'll fight against the woke, whatever that means. And it sends a message like, how can we do this work when we are being told to like shut our mouths and do this a specific way that it's not effective? Like, how can you do anti-violence work in a violent system? It doesn't compute. So
Yeah.
it was one of the big things that did end up pushing me out of the field as well, because I just couldn't see a way through. I couldn't see a leadership that was willing to get away from these funders and find a way, another way, basically. And it was extremely frustrating. And I wanted to just yell and scream, like, why are we still taking our marching orders from people who hate us?
Mm. Wow. That is really powerful, really powerful. And I want to thank you for your vulnerability and your transparency in sharing about what it's like living in a place that's hostile, not to just your mission, but also to who you are and the human being that just exists in that work. And the way that being at an agency that's not protecting its people in that time really compounds that experience. And I think we saw it on a national level. I'm in New Jersey, and
Mhm.
in February there was that national. Um, you probably didn't know about it in Florida, maybe because you already had to deal with it, but to remove all that language, the same way that you had to navigate that at a state level, there were there were federal kind of initiatives that put out
Yeah. Oh,
that
we were seeing
mandate.
this long before
Yeah,
it was kind of the blueprint because, people look at people in positions of power have looked at Florida as a blueprint for how they can implement this on the national level, unfortunately.
yeah, yeah. That's very telling when we see how things are roll out and when you think about Florida as a pilot, really changes your perspective on some of the things that are going on currently. So I think that values misalignment, I think I know for myself and for many others that have left the field, that that is kind of just too much to take. I'm in an agency where we're supposed to be working to end violence. I'm now experiencing abuse within my agency. We're not even aligning with the mission at this point. I don't get paid very much. Like, I checks notes, like, what are the reasons that I should stay? There's nothing left. I don't know what to do here. Um, we're so out of alignment. So it makes sense why we're kind of hemorrhaging workers. But I think, yes, thank you for sharing that about your experience in Florida, because I think it also helps me be reminded and grateful for some of the ways the local government has and continues to protect the work in some states while it um, doesn't do that in some other states, and how that is creates a really different terrain for anti-violence advocates across the nation, even though we're still navigating many of the same things.
Absolutely.
So, from your point of view, how are your former coworkers being impacted by the dynamics that were highlighted in the survey and some of the issues we've already talked about?
Yeah, I am very much in touch with a lot of colleagues who some of them have also left just like me. Some of them are still in it, and the ones who are still in it, especially in the state of Florida, I don't know how many of my colleagues actually participated in that survey. I do remember that. I don't even remember if I did, but it's still very much the same. And then in that, with the low pay, with um, those office politics. But I think the thing that they're seeing increasingly more and more of is just the lack of transparency in leadership. I think especially within the last few years, first of all, COVID kind of threw like a huge wrench into so many things. It exposed a lot of things. All of a sudden, we were able to telehealth. All of a sudden, we were able to start talking about, you know, how centers in rural locations are being served and all the gaps. We were noticing all these things. And then increasingly more and more, I think there was a pressure point where we were realizing, what are we going to do when these funders that we have jumped through hoops for and who we've tried to work in increasingly narrower margins to like toe the line for just drop us. They were going to do it anyway. And this was a reckoning that I was seeing that I knew was going to come of we have to start thinking about where we get our money from. We have to start thinking about how we choose to prioritize services. We have to start thinking about the compensation packages of CEOs in nonprofits. And it's a reckoning that I think came too late for a lot of organizations. And so my colleagues, they have had to like do this dance in their organizations and look at their leaders and be like, do you see what's going on in the world around us? What is our answer? What is our response? And I think right now, from what I'm hearing from my colleagues, there is this constant messaging of trying to keep your head down and pretend like everything's business as usual, which is insane. They're just
That,
trying to get through it. They're trying to weather the storm when what we need is big revolutionary change if they want to survive, if they even should at this point. Because again, what is your agency doing to respond to the needs of people who are being affected by policy? And how effective are you being if you cannot challenge these structures?
yeah, I mean, now we're at the point where I'm gonna have a hard time choosing which quote to pluck out to advertise this podcast episode because you're just dropping bombs left and right. But yeah, I think I don't know that there is a way to work with a funder that is using the funding as a means of power and control. When you
Yeah,
talked about it as dangling it in front of you and making these demands, that's that's what an abusive partner does with the child support, with the alimony.
yeah,
That's
yep,
I'm going to use this economic means of power and control. And I think you were right with that foresight of when we're dropped completely because that's what's happening now, and it's
yep.
kind of forcing the hand of folks. But are we seeing CEOs look at their own packages before letting go direct services? I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't think so, but I would hope so. I would hope that you would value a direct service placement over your own package. But I'm a dreamer. And maybe a little naive. Yeah.
You,
So
just to add, I don't, this is a little bit of a tangent, but kind of relevant in that you have to look up the story of the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. You have to look up how we used to have the state coalition for domestic violence programs that imploded because of corruption from the CEO. And now those services have been dissolved into like other programs like Department of Children and Families, but there was a whole coalition that disappeared and imploded because of CEO corruption. And I'm not even really sure what happened to her. Um, it happened and then COVID happened. So I don't know if she was able to get away with it. But you have to look up this story because it is amazing. But I remember working at the State Coalition for Sexual Violence Programs and finding out what happened to the Domestic Violence Coalition and then going to their office to like take their printers and all their office supplies and then seeing those workers saying like, yep, all of us have just lost our jobs because of stuff that was happening at the top. We were doing
wow.
great work. They were doing amazing necessary work. I used to attend their trainings and they're just gone. So
Wow. I'm
it is
definitely going to look
amazing.
that story up because I'm very intrigued. Wow. I wonder if we'll be able to find out the conclusion to that tale because that sounds, I think, unfortunately, probably one of many where that's the case, where that's happening. I
Yeah,
know that Florida was not on the list of organizations that signed the letter um, of committing to reevaluating where white supremacy is internalized in their agency after George Floyd was murdered.
I'm not
Florida
surprised.
Florida agencies were definitely absent from signing on to agreement of that. So that also
I am not
speaks volumes.
surprised. And I was, at the time when that happened, I was working at the state coalition, and this one of many failed conversations in this very small little organization that was in charge of a lot of state funding. One of the very few people of color as well who banded with the other people of color to try and have conversations within our organization about white allyship, about um, you know, lifting up the voices of the marginalized and being shut down. I was there and I remember, and again, one of the many frustrations that pushed me out of the field or chased me out of the field, really.
Yeah. And I don't, we don't want other people to have experienced the things that you're speaking about, but I know that you've seen the survey results. It's also validating to know that it's not just we're not alone in this and that
Yeah,
kind of we need to flip everything on its head. That when we're looking at providing services or we're supposed to provide something that speaks to the most marginalized. And I think we're a little bit far from that if we're not even able to kind of recognize identities as different from each other
yeah,
or, see someone's full identity as a person.
yeah. And I think especially when I want to think about this from perspective of like being a survivor as well and realizing that the conditions that are created by the system, especially in the nonprofit industrial complex, they're not conducive towards survivor safety or emotional well-being. The policies that are, implemented at the top that trickle down in effects to people who access those services, we're recreating the conditions for survivors for abuse. We're recreating the conditions for the workers and, just accessing these systems as a survivor. Like when I first started in anti-violence work, I thought to myself, again, coming into this, not having had that support when I was growing up and thinking, wow, this is so wonderful. This should be the gold standard everywhere, only to realize that in having this very naive perspective and then getting into the rec service and realizing the way that we've set up these systems for people to access them doesn't work. Like when I think about how we did victim compensation, for example, making survivors report to law enforcement, giving them a measly $2,000 to relocate to escape an abusive situation, having them jump through hoops, like document, like we need receipts for every purchase you've made. Otherwise, we will prosecute you. And making them go through law enforcement to get anything, if law enforcement does anything. And then on top of that, perpetuating abuse for the workers, exploiting them, saying that, no, we'll pay you $12 an hour to answer the suicide hotline, which that's what I got when I worked on suicide hotline, which was crazy. Again, hardest job I've ever had. And it's it's no wonder that we're losing really, really good people with really, really good intentions and a lot of passion in this work that really needs it. And that breaks my heart. And yet I find myself wanting to go back, which I don't know why.
Yeah. I mean, I get it. I get it. Believe me, I get it. As someone that was in the field for 20 years and left, here I am spending my free time talking about it on a podcast because it's just, I think that is like you were talking about before, how some workers can be exploited because of the mission, because it really does
Yeah,
like have this um comes from this internal passion to kind of make a difference in that work in for people that are navigating that issue,
yeah,
but also this reliance on carceral systems in the first place, not even just to navigate the VC, the compensation, but all along the route, we know that that is not necessarily the best for people that are navigating marginalized identities.
yeah.
So, what lessons or learned or advice do you have for any advocates that are still navigating this type of work environment?
Yeah. I think as we've discussed and realized throughout this episode is that the system has been built very wrong. And a lot of I feel leadership in these organizations are trying to play catch up and try to like shove everything still into this box that just doesn't fit anymore. But there's a movement that's happening. I feel there's a reckoning that's been happening across the board for the anti-violence movement, for social workers, for advocates, for clinicians. You know, people are going back to like the grassroots movements. People are going to mutual aid, understanding that community is how we get through this together, finding finding avenues outside of the system that doesn't work for them anymore. And I think that's very inspiring. I mean, one of them is this We Deserve Better project in the first place. People who are willing to continue to speak up and say, we need to do different. We need to try something else. Um, I would say for advocates, for people who are navigating this work field, this workforce, remember your worth. Uh, take all your PTO. But besides that, you're going to be challenged ethically in so many ways, especially now more than ever, to do the right thing. And I don't want to see people fall into the rabbit hole, into the complacency of this is just how it is. And for people, especially marginalized identities, we can't afford that because we will be used and exploited in that way. The system wants perfect victims. You are not in, you are not flawed or wrong for saying that something is wrong, for saying that something's not right. And I don't want the system to ever convince people that that's otherwise. On a more concrete level, when I say that the system wants perfect victims, it's, when we talk about like survivors who are accessing services, for example, they want people who reported to law enforcement within 72 hours. They want people who don't fight back, who don't uh, cause problems. They don't want to let people who've had some kind of criminal background, however mundane the reason is, to access anything. But it also parallels in the workforce, in the anti-violence workforce, that those trauma symptoms that cause survivors to be gate kept from services also are used against workers. Like, as a survivor myself, I have had my trauma symptoms manifest during work, or especially like during COVID when everybody was isolated and my depression symptoms were at an all-time high. And that was used against me when, oh, we didn't get this report on time because I was struggling. And then knowing my supervisor, knowing my background, knowing what I've been through, knowing what I'm going through, on top of us navigating all dynamics of pandemic world for the first time and not knowing what to do about it, using that against me of you're a bad worker, you're not good at this job, you're lazy, and causing even more trauma in that aspect. And the system wants the system wants people who work in an environment that is surrounded by trauma to act like this is just a normal thing and we have to function properly. We have to not show weakness. We have to not show vulnerability, which is goes so far against what we're taught on how to respond to survivors because you have to have a little bit of vulnerability when you work in this environment because we're forging human connections. We're trying to promote healing. We're showing empathy and compassion. And then to have that used against us, I think is such an ultimate betrayal of the values that we're supposed to hold in this field.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that. It has me thinking about that human connection is actually part of the healing for folks that have been harmed by other humans. It's like a supposed to be a restorative experience. And um, how can we hold the space of the manifestation of trauma symptoms being, what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you if we're being treated by our own agency, by, that system in a way that it's something that's wrong with you, right? How can you possibly provide that service for clients if you're not receiving that same kindness, but instead having it used as a sword against you?
Yeah, and
I
ultimately it
wonder.
becomes the answer is you need to do self-care, which there's only so much self-care you
uh,
can do.
we stay tuned for an upcoming episode about that dynamic, because that one's on the way. Certainly,
Yay.
have a lot to say about self-care and the way that that is the response. But it again, when you talk about the mimicking of dynamics of abuse, mental health. No victims ever had their mental health used against them, right? No,
Hmm.
that's right. And also, just to take a step back, we live in a society built on power and control and oppression,
Yeah,
colonialist, capitalist society that really relishes this system, this structure. And so, that's why when we're talking about before you mentioned corporate versus retail, it depends on who's in charge. Really less the system that you're in, because you could be in a corporate system and that person is built based on humanity and humility and respect
yeah,
for their workers. And you can be in a nonprofit where they're not. And
yeah,
so I think it's like what we talked about a lot, kind of the thread together for me is like you expect different when the mission of that field is a certain your expectations are that it wouldn't be this way, and it's the higher you are the farther you fall a little bit
yeah.
too.
It is very sinister that and I've seen this a lot, especially with people who are very new to the anti-violence movement who are coming in fresh, like just like when I think about myself when going in as a fresh graduate and being in this environment thinking, wow, it's so filled with compassion and kindness. It's not like other places. We're not like other girls type environment. Only to realize, no, the same corporate shenanigans are going to happen in this environment. It's just a little more sinister in that they get to rely on but we're doing this mission. We're doing kindness. We're helping people like the politicians who come to like a local rape crisis center and be like, look how much we care about this cause while also gutting funding to a cause. And it is this dynamic that I think a lot of new people, and I would say this for people who are coming into this field for the first time, to be very wary of, how these stories get utilized and how they get portrayed and who benefits from that. But besides that, especially being in academia right now and seeing people who are going through the courses to become licensed clinicians, like the future therapists, I guess. Some practical things like if you are looking for your internship placement and you already work at an organization, do not do your internship at the place you already work. That is a huge conflict of interest, which can be really convenient, but it will put a lot of power in your supervisor's hands because not only are you relying on them for your job, but you're also relying on them for your hours and your academic approval. So do not do that if you can.
Those are some pretty wise words of advice, I have to say. Certainly, we know that elevating the voices of marginalized folks is really critical. And so I think it's always really a privilege for me to have the opportunity to hear from different folks, have them share out in this platform, their visions, because I think it really does take we need to kind of go back on professionalization of the system and all these things, that more grassroots approach, and really
Yeah.
listening to different perspectives on solutions is really the way to go.
That actually reminds me, speaking of professionalization, I also want to encourage folks who are in this field to, like I said before, the whole standing up when you do see something wrong, when just because there are institutions that are in like established positions, we do not have to follow that route. Be a rebel, be punk rock, go against the grain just because the National Association of Social Workers is, the standard for like our ethics, our code of ethics. And yet it's the same organization that should be championing payment for placement for interns, should be championing unionization, should be championing federal licensure, is supposed to be the voice box for social workers all across the country. You do not have to abide and follow their rules. Of course, they're setting like a nice little template of their code of ethics. But when the organization that espouses those ethics isn't doing those ethics themselves, that's when you have to call it out. And there are other spaces that are existing in this field. Um, I forget his name. It's Marvin Tolliver, who's created this really, really great space for future social workers. He's created like group classes for people on how to pass the licensing exam and calling out the licensing exam for being racist and for being classist, talking about the costs and the expenditures that social workers have to do in order to maintain their licensure, things like that. And just all these collectives that are out there, like We Deserve Better project, who are out there and challenging these spaces just because they're established and prestigious, that we don't have to just look to them, especially if the people who are looking to as leaders, as voice boxes, aren't out there fighting, then we have to do something else. And we can't wait for them to do it for us.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm glad you brought up ethics again because it reminded me of something I wanted to say before, which is that the ethical thing isn't always the legal thing,
Yeah.
right? It's not always the thing on paper. And that was when I took over teaching an ethics course. That was one of the quotes that really stuck out for me, right? Is that, sometimes our agency policy, NSAW or NASW, code of ethics, the laws that govern this nation don't actually align with
Yep.
our values and the way that we need to ethically operate in order to serve survivors,
Yep.
because that's
You
the
have
mission.
a moral obligation to reject any order that is unethical, that doesn't align with your values. You have a moral obligation to resist. If you are at an agency that is telling you to let ICE agents in to question your clients, you have a moral obligation to resist, for example.
Yeah. A moral like obligation for defiance and non-compliance, I would
Exactly.
say. Yeah, I love that. So my last question is, what recommendations do you have for leaders and change makers as we're kind of all looking to say, okay, this isn't working. So everyone, whenever you say something's not working, people are like, well, then what's the answer? Well, okay, let's take some time to build it. So you don't have to have it fully fleshed out, but any ideas, thoughts, recommendations?
My recommendation is you have to be bold. This is the time for boldness. And you either adapt, challenge, listen to the people who hold you up, or you get left behind. That is what I can say. Because we do not have time to play nice. We do not have time for what's the term I'm looking for? Political correctness, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't really like using that, but we don't have time for respectability. That's what I meant. We don't have time for
Mm.
respectability right now. This is a state of emergency, and you're either going to do something about it, or we will have to find a way to move forward. Because trying to keep your head down and pretend that it's business as usual, trying to operate like things aren't on fire is insane. And
Yeah.
you're not going to survive on that path.
Yeah. When you said that, it just reminded me, the classic meme of the dog with the coffee cup
Yeah.
sitting at the table, like
This
everything's
is fine.
fine. So I recently saw an iteration of that, and the dog is like got a fire extinguisher and is running around like it's not fine.
hmm
And under it was like, we can't continue to dissociate and pretend everything's fine. Like you said, this is a crisis. Get with the program.
Yeah.
The time is now.
Yeah. We either call out what your marching orders are, or you obey them. And obeying them is, like you said, non-compliance. That's what we need.
Yeah. Well, those have been some really powerful thoughts. And so I want to thank you so much for joining me today, for sharing about your experiences in anti-violence work and your visions for a brighter future. It's always a privilege when a survivor of abuse chooses to share their story. Hopefully, all of you listening out there learned something, were validated in your own experiences, inspired to raise awareness, or maybe all of the above. Be sure to take a moment to care for yourselves after listening today, especially if you're also a survivor of abuse or currently navigating these dynamics. Know that you aren't alone and it's not your fault. We deserve better. Thanks for listening. If you or someone you know is interested in joining the We Deserve Better project or being a guest on the podcast, check out the show notes for details on how to connect. And be sure to tune in for new episodes airing the first Monday of the month, or subscribe to get notified. Remember, anti-violence work is neither anti-violent nor working to end violence. So keep talking and reimagining amongst yourselves.